Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are some of the issues confronting the 54 African countries as far as the promoting good labor standards and reducing youth unemployment? What is one United Nations agency, namely the International Labor Organization, doing to help accomplish these goals? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at one United Nations agency and what it's doing to help the 54 African countries to reduce the high unemployment rates among youth, to promote good safety standards for workers, and deal with a myriad of other issues. My guest today is an expert on this agency. My guest today is Mr. Aeneas Chuma. Mr. Chuma of Zimbabwe is the Regional Director of the International Labor Organization's Regional Office for Africa, located in Addis Ababa. Mr. Chuma, prior to joining the ILO, gained over 25 years of experience in development work with the United Nations. Mr. Aeneas Chuma, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into some of your specific programs, but let's talk a little bit about the International Labor Organization. When was it formed? Why was it formed? Basically, what is its mission?
Well, it's a very old organization, actually. It was formed in 1919. After the Second World War, and also in the post-industrial period of Europe, as it were, where there were sharp differences between owners of the means of production and the workers, and there were no standards that regulated conditions of employment and safety in the places of work. So it was designed in part to essentially protect the right of workers and make sure that they get a fair share from their labor.
Exactly. And as I recall, I think the ILO is the third oldest of the United Nations specialized agencies, right behind the perhaps the Universal Postal Union and the Telecommunications Union.
True.
So you've got a long track record. It's
Absolutely.
certainly out there. Well, ILO is unique in many ways, and one is because it's a tripartite organization. What do we mean when I say tripartite?
Right. Well, tripartite means that the ILO works with governments. It also works with employers' organizations, and it works with workers' organizations, trade unions, as it were. And it encourages social dialogue between the three major actors in any society, really, and to try to promote social compact and social justice for the workers, but also for the employers, and also to encourage the governments to assume their responsibilities in this respect.
Now, as the director of the regional office in Africa, do you go into each of the 54 African countries and work with this tripartite group, the employers, the laborers, and the governments? Do you deal with them together individually, or how's that? Or is the situation different from time to time?
Well, I mean, as regional director, I coordinate the work of our network of offices. We have 12 offices all over Africa, and each office covers a set of countries, and they do both technical work as well as political work. And in all the countries, as you mentioned, Bill, we work around the principle of tripartism. We work with the governments, we work with the workers' representatives, and also we work with the employers' representatives.
In the opening, I mentioned a myriad of issues and challenges, really, and one is the high youth unemployment. It's not just in African countries, it's in many areas around the world, even in developed countries to some degree. What is being done on this front, and what can ILO do to help overcome this problem?
I think what has happened, Bill, is that over the last decade or so, we've seen that African economies have grown sustainably, and on average about 5–6% a year. But we've also noticed that the growth has not generated enough jobs to absorb the large numbers of young Africans that enter the labor force every year. So that is an issue in that respect. I think part of it is because Africa is a very young population. On average, 50% of the African population is under the age of 30. So it's a very young population. They enter the labor market every year, and they're not getting opportunities for productive employment. And so that's a major issue.
Certainly is. And if our viewers would like more information, they can go to www.ilo.org and get a lot more information about what we're talking about and what we won't get to today. We talk about youth unemployment. Of course, the idea is to have employment opportunities for them. Right. The private sector plays a critical role in this, obviously the major role. But what can be done to help the governments perhaps get involved and not create just makeshift employment, but to do something that's really substantive, to create employment programs that put youth to work, perhaps rebuilding the country, rebuilding roads or whatever. Every country's infrastructure needs services from time to time, but what can be done on the part of the government?
I think there's several things on the part of the government. First and foremost, they have to create conditions that allow the private sector to invest. Because the private sector really creates wealth and creates jobs and opportunities as well. But to do that, they need a policy that is enabling. And that's the responsibility primarily of the government in itself. The government needs to provide infrastructure, so that the private sector can operate in infrastructure, the roads, things, the type of things that a private company cannot do or is not expected to do in a normal economy. But where you have high levels of unemployment, the government could also come up with programs of building infrastructure that utilize the large number of unemployed youth, what we refer to as labor-intensive public works, as it were. Yes.
That is extremely important to do that. Very, very important, because we know that when youth, anybody, when they're unemployed, they lose hope. They have too much time on their hands. They can go off and do some negative types of activities and get involved in whatever, terrorism, who knows? I mean, there's really no limit to what they can do. So it's very important. I mentioned also in the opening about safe labor standards. This is very, very important. What role does the ILO play in promoting safety standards throughout the African countries?
Okay, Bill, if you allow me, before I come to the question of safety, what you mentioned is critical. There is a danger to having large numbers of young people, well-educated, able-bodied, willing to work, but not having opportunities for productive work. If you look at the conflicts that we have seen in Africa, by and large, they have been perpetuated by young people that don't have employment opportunities. And the young people have also been victims. So the issue of employment is not only necessary for national development, but it's also important to consolidate the peace going forward. I just wanted to make that point. Now, if you come to the question that you asked about safety, one of the roles of the International Labour Organization is to develop and set global norms and standards with respect to the world of work. People take it for granted, but the issues around an 8-hour day, sick leave, annual leave, those are some of the standards that were set through the International Labour Organizations over the years, as it were. But increasingly, safety, occupational safety in the workplace, the fact that workers now in construction are required to wear helmets, for example, for protection, or protection in the mines, or in industry, or in safety, or the safety of, say, chemicals in a chemical factory. Those are some of the standards that the ILO over time has developed protocols, not as an institution, but working with governments, working with employers' organizations, and also with workers' organizations. I think that's one of the major contributions of the International Labour Organization to the world of work.
Are there, I know it varies from country to country, but do you see the formation of labor unions in the private sector, in the public sector? Is the labor union movement growing, generally speaking, across Africa, or Is it losing steam? And we can get into that in just a minute, what's happening in the United States and some other countries. But
Right.
what is the situation in Africa right now?
Well, I think the starting point is that in terms of what we refer to as Convention number 87, workers have the right of freedom of association. They have the right to organize themselves, and they engage in collective bargaining with their employers, as it were. Now, what is happening in Africa is that there has been based on that principle, a growth in the number of sector, related unions, as it were. It could be in the mining industry, it could be in manufacturing, and then beyond that, it could be manufacturing in a particular industry, as it were, leather industry or something like that. So you have a lot of unions. But what has happened also is that, as you know, Bill, in recent years, there has been an economic crisis, really global, since 2008, 2009. And so the workers' movement grows when workers' numbers grow. But where you have a decline in employment, it means often the membership also declines, as it were. So I would say that the labor unions are quite well organized, they're quite strong. They face serious challenges in Africa in the context of declining employment opportunities for their members. But the structures are there, and part of our role as ILO is to strengthen their governance structures, so that they are representative, and so that they periodically convene congresses of their membership to renew and revalidate their mandates, so that the genuine leaders, it's not a one-person show or anything.
And you mentioned the 8-hour day, 40-hour-a-week
Yes.
work week,
Right.
which is so important. Of course, it was the labor movement that really got that started in the United States and in other countries to promote that. And today we see that there's, a lot of people believe that the labor unions, the labor movement is what really helped create a very vibrant, healthy, socioeconomic group, middle-class economy in the United States and many other developed countries.
Right.
But today we see in the United States that there's really an anti-labor movement underway, and there's been a gutting of this really the economic fiber of this middle class, through primarily because of laws passed by Congress, through deregulation, different things like that.
Right.
Do you see that as a problem, not only perhaps in African countries, but also in developed countries?
Well, I think it's always a challenge when the fundamental rights of people in the world of work are threatened. And it's not just the rights of workers, these are human rights, as it were, and they must always be protected. So even though there has been some pushback because of the economic circumstances, as it were, by and large, the rights of workers are respected in this country. And by and large, the rights of workers to organize themselves as they see fit are respected, in the same manner that employers themselves can organize themselves by industry, by sector, to push their interests, and that's to be expected. So there will always be friction, really, as it were. The workers agitating for better conditions of work, living wage, and the employers preoccupied with the profit margin, wanting to cut cost, and even the threat to jobs themselves, often through improvements in technology. The use of robots instead of workers, and all this. So all these things are dynamic, and they're exciting, and they have to be negotiated going forward. And as the world advances, there are new forms of work and employment that may not be easy to unionize. Most young people now can work from home on a computer, and you can't unionize that type of thing. So the world of work is evolving, it's dynamic, but there's still room for organized work by sector, by industry, going forward. So all these dynamic forces are still there.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website, www.globalconnectionstelevision.com, to comment on this program and perhaps to make suggestions for future guests and future programs. Today we're talking about the United Nations International Labor Organization and specifically focusing on the region of Africa and its 54 countries. My guest today is an expert on this agency. My guest today is Mr. Aeneas Chuma of Zimbabwe, who is the Regional Director of the International Labor Organization's Office for Africa in Addis Ababa. We were talking about the situation with labor and the right to form bargain collectively. When you go into a country, you're invited into the country. The ILO is not a supranational. A lot of people have this misconception about the United Nations. It's a supranational organization. It can go in and tell everybody what to do, which is totally wrong, but some people have that misconception. But how do you're invited in to work with the employers, with the government, with the labor folks, and you always are invited in to do this. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, actually, it's a very good point that the United Nations funds and programs work in countries by invitation of the government of a particular country, except, of course, in war and crisis situation. Where the United Nations is the right to protect. And so the way we work is that we engage with the government, we engage with what we refer to as social partners, which refers to the labor movement, as well as the employers' organizations. And we develop programs of work in consultation with those three. One of the programs that we develop in Africa is referred to as the decent work country programs for various countries in Africa, where we encourage investments in areas that generate jobs, good jobs that pay decent wages, and under conditions of safety for the workers and respect for the fundamental rights of the workers themselves. And so we do work in countries, but it's with partners, local partners and other international partners as well.
That term decent work is very important, and we all want decent work, obviously. Yes. How do you translate that, though? I mean, how do you define decent work?
Well, it's actually it's by definition what referred to as decent work. It's where the workers have social protection, where the fundamental rights of the workers are respected, such as the right to collective bargaining and to organization, where there is a decent wage, and the workers feel that they get adequate remuneration for the type of work they do, to the same extent also that the employer feel that they're getting good value for money. So decent work refers to that type of work that subscribes to all these principles and practices and norms that have been developed over decades with respect to the world of work.
Exactly. And we're talking about decent work, and safety conditions are very important. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the environment within where you're working, the building, the safety of that structure. Right. And I think back to Bangladesh. I know Bangladesh is not in Africa, but we remember the Rana Plaza disaster in the clothing. It was a sweatshop primarily, is what it was. And of course, the building collapsed. I think over 1,000 people were killed and many others injured. Have you had similar situations in some of the African countries? And what can you do to work with the countries to tighten those standards to make sure those buildings are safe?
Yes. Well, I think you're right. The collapse of the building in Bangladesh was tragic. We were involved in trying to work with the government to create conditions such that a similar occurrence doesn't happen. The ILO has a strong tradition in providing support for labor inspectors who visit places of work and make sure that they're safe for the workers and that the rights of workers are respected. All countries have that. The Department of Labor is inspectors. The U.S. Department of Labor, a major partner for the International Labor Organization, by the way, is inspectors that help look at safety and conditions. And so in all countries, these exist. The big difference, of course, is in the quality of these services between countries. In some countries, the services are very strong. You've got an inspectorate, and you've got structures, you have systems, you've got a budget, and you have inspectors that are employed. In other countries, it's not so strong. you know. And I think part of the problem in, you know, in Bangladesh was precisely that, that to some extent the structures were compromised in a way. The building wasn't, you know, standards worthy, and the conditions of work were also not quite in line with generally accepted principles, you know. But we're working with the government in Bangladesh to try and address this and ensure that it doesn't recur. But we also work with employers to make sure that they understand their obligations, and that they meet their obligations. You know, they don't have to be inspected, but they can self-inspect and self-compliant to make sure that the standards are met, and that's important. Yeah.
It certainly is.
Otherwise, you'll have to put an inspector in every home.
That's right.
You know, and that's not. You
It's
know,
not practical,
no,
nor
absolutely
economically feasible, probably.
absolutely, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
The whole situation too. You hear the argument that, especially in the United States and probably some of the other developed countries, is that the wages are so high in the United States that they can't compete with, say, a garment worker in Bangladesh or in Honduras or in Vietnam or whatever the case might be. But by lowering the standards in the United States, are we not creating a situation where it's a race to the bottom instead of trying to raise the standards of somebody who may be working for 20 cents an hour in Vietnam? I'm just making up that.
Yeah. No, I understand.
That
I
fee,
understand. Yeah,
but
yeah.
should we not be trying to raise the standards, and how can we do that?
Well, I think it's a very good point. I mean, there's no universal single wage level for all countries, precisely because the cost structures are different in different countries. The standards of living are different, but also even the level of productivity is different, and the issues around the supply of labor, because when you have a lot of people that are not in employment, it tends to suppress, you know, wage levels. I think the important point, the important principle is to define what one would call not quite a minimum wage per se, but a living wage, you know, based on the local conditions and local circumstances and analysis, you know, which says that, you know, by and large, you know, the living conditions or the minimum wage, whatever you want to call them, are different between countries. Even within countries, they may be different between industries, you know, between skills levels and all. But what we provide as ILO are principles of how to arrive at a decent living wage or minimum wage through negotiations, through objective analysis of objective data, you know, trends, costs, inflation, levels of productivity, you know, and so all these factors have to be taken into account. I think what has been problematic, particularly in the migration of jobs, you know, to areas where the unit costs of labor are low, has been an element of exploitation or perceived exploitation of the workers, as it were, in the sweatshops, you know, going forward. And but there's nothing wrong in a factory establishing a manufacturing base in China or in Africa or in India, as long as the fundamental rights of the workers in the workplace are treated. You know, they are paid fairly, and there's safety in the conditions. And it's a win-win situation, you know, for the factory that relocates and finds value and cost effectiveness in operating an apparel factory in Bangladesh, and for the Bangladeshis themselves. The government collects revenue, workers have jobs, they can pay wages, they can pay their bills, they can send their children to school, they can improve their lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a win-win situation.
It can be a win-win
Right.
situation, and
Well,
it should be.
Exactly. In the last 30 seconds, we have the
Yeah.
hardest question. What is the major challenge confronting the ILO and the African continent as we go well into the 21st century?
I think the major challenge is very clear. This is the lack of employment opportunities for a very young population, well educated relatively compared to their parents' generation, able-bodied, very eager, and where you have then the formal sector not being able to generate enough jobs to absorb these large numbers of young people that enter the labor market every year. That's a huge challenge. I think what is important is to encourage investment and growth in the economy, but deal with the question of investment that generates jobs, that generates opportunities, that makes sure that those that are outside the economy are brought into the economy and contribute to the development of the country. That's of the continent and the individual countries, and that's essential for the peace, actually, for stability, for social cohesion, and for social justice and for progress, as it were. So these are critical challenges that we face in Africa, but with time we're up to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the critical challenges we're facing really all around the world, and we really need to do that. We need to have a well-educated population. We need to have a fully employed population. We need to have people contributing, achieving their self-actualization. They have rights to bargain collectively, and we should have this minimum wage, as you mentioned, to help elevate people out of poverty. And of course, that removes them too from receiving perhaps government assistance in other programs, and it strengthens the economy. But Mr. Aeneas Chuma, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and very informative program.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.